It sounds like clinical pathways can create win-win situations for physicians and payers. What is standing in the way of broad rollout for pathway initiatives?
Well, pathways have got to be regional. They've got to be in the smaller pockets. You see a lot of different organizations out there that have tried to push pathways on a national scale, and it just doesn't happen that way. If you look at the different disparities in costs when you're treating a cancer patient or a Medicare patient, different areas of the country, it does dramatically change. So they have to be taken in smaller groups, statewide, regional-wide, and then that pathways have to be adopted by the local physicians in that community.
Many models for clinical pathways include a push to use generic alternatives over branded drugs, where appropriate, as a way to drive cost efficiencies. How threatened should branded drug manufacturers be by this line of thinking?
I think that's the biggest misconception that's out there on a pathway program, that the only way you can reach savings or you can achieve any kind of quality is through the generic conversion of a product. That's just a very small piece of the pie there. You look at the generic conversion, you're also limiting lines of therapy, you're talking about standardization of treatment, you're identifying different outliers, and then you're looking at end-of-life care. So a manufacturer shouldn't feel too concerned or too threatened by that very small piece of it, because as they go through the process and they're looking at perhaps a generic equivalent, so to speak, when they're dealing with their product, they're finding that it's very helpful if they can look at that and see if there is a generic equivalent, to start having that dialogue with the providers and with the payers to be able to show, look, we've got the data to be able to support why we think our product works best in this scenario. But if they get involved in the process, if they get involved in the solution, they're going to see that actually they're going to come out much farther ahead in this process, opposed to just focusing on that one small piece of it, on the generic equivalent. We need to look more at limiting the lines of therapy. We need to look at end-of-life care, which is a huge item.
In what ways can branded drug manufacturers participate in the development of clinical pathways without feeling like they are intentionally reducing the life cycle of their own product?
That's a great question, because they can do a lot to be able to support these regional groups and these providers. They can provide the data. All of these pathways are based on clinical evidence, period. They're not on a pathway unless you've got the data to back it up. So the good thing about that is that when you've got these local steering committees or these physicians in these different pockets around the country that are developing their pathways, if they have a partner in the pharmaceutical community to be able to provide them with the data, to be able to provide them with real-life scenarios on how their product is used on that different line of therapy, we're finding that they're huge proponents of these pathways because they ultimately want their product to be used appropriately. And that's what it's coming down to at these pathways. They're appropriate, they're following the evidence on this, and then it's a win for the patient in that, because it's decreasing a lot of the variability of care.
How do clinical pathways sync up with other cost containment initiatives gaining momentum within the industry, like comparative effectiveness? Again, how should manufacturers be viewing these trends, and can they be doing anything differently?
Well, they can get more involved in the process. They can understand how the pathways are working in each of the community. Again, they can provide the data to be able to support the use of that. And a lot of times people confuse pathways with the clinical evidence, and they're not the same. Although they're looking at the end product of what is the best treatment for that disease, but we're finding that the manufacturers have a huge role in this. And it comes back to getting access to that data for those providers so that they can make the appropriate decisions, and also help them with the appropriate data and the cost data for that lines of therapy. And I think a lot of the manufacturers are taking those steps right now.
When it comes to creating actionable and practical clinical pathways, what are payers looking for?
Well, the payers, they're looking for reducing the variability of care. Even though we may not think that there's a huge variation in how patients are being treated, there is a huge change, anywhere from 30 to 60%. We've looked at different markets on how different cancer patients are being treated. So the variability of care is incredibly important to these payers, because the payers want to be able to know what their costs are. And if they know that 30% of the time or 60% of the time or 90% of the time this patient is going to be treated this way, then they can control their costs a little bit more, and they can be able to anticipate what those costs. So the big issue for them is the variability of care, and not to minimize that, they want quality, they want the best treatment for the lives that they have control over, but it really comes down to that variability of that care.
Lesli, it looks like our time is almost up, but thank you so much for being with us today.
You're welcome.
And thank you for joining us. We'll be back soon with part 2 of this discussion with Lesli. Until then, if it's on your mind, it's in the know.